I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So, Laura Engleby has worked in the marine mammal field for over 30 years, with 15 of those years at NOAA, where she is currently the chief of the Marine Mammal Branch, NOAA Fisheries Southeast Regional Office. Her branch is responsible for the conservation, protection, recovery, and restoration of marine mammals throughout the Southeast region. In addition to her regular duties, Laura has been very involved with all aspects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, from initial response to restoration planning. Laura is presently the co-lead with NOAA's Restoration Center for the Federal Marine Mammal Restoration Corps team and is working with state and federal trustee implementation groups to plan and implement restoration for marine mammals in the Gulf.
All right, well, good almost afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting this and having the opportunity to talk about restoration. My personal first experience with restoration was back in the 90s when I worked for the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and I recall back at the time there was a PhD, I don't know if he had his PhD then, Eric Bartels from the Marine Lab, who was figuring out ways to grow corals and then transplant them out on the reefs. And so my first exposure to restoration was with coral restoration, and to this day that's a technique that is used quite a bit. Unfortunately, with marine mammals, we have a lot more of a challenge ahead of us. So, here we go. I hope the folks can hear me okay on the phone, and I hope I'm not disrupted with my notes as I turn pages here. So under OPA, what is restoration? Under OPA and NERDA, restoration is any action or combination of actions to restore, rehabilitate, replace, or acquire the equivalent of injured natural resources and services. And given the variety of natural resources, particularly in the case with DWH, restoration can take many forms, like the form I just mentioned about growing corals in nurseries and transplanting them, but it can also be things like creating marsh habitat, adding habitat to protected areas, creating bird nesting islands and things like that. As far as restoration for marine mammals, we are charting pretty new territory. DWH, to my knowledge, is one of the first times that marine mammals has been focused on by NERDA, and because of this, my focus will be on DWH. However, I will mention that since DWH, we now have 4 active NRDA cases that include marine mammals nationwide. So, as a manager or somebody who implements things like the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, sort of as a practitioner of those legal mandates, I'm struck by the similarities of the desired outcomes for restoration and for what we need to do under the Endangered Species Act, where our goal is to recover the species so they no longer need protection under the Act, and the recovery plan is our roadmap to get there. And for the Marine Mammal Protection Act, we're directed to take any measures that prevent or address any stocks of marine mammals that fall below their optimum sustainable population, or to a point at which they cease to become significant functioning elements of their ecosystem. That's Marine Mammal Protection Act language. So while there is similarity, implementing these actions in the context of the Oil Pollution Act and NRDA is very new to marine mammals and marine mammal experts. So how we're going about this in the context of DWH is going to be the focus of my next talk. All right, so I'm going to step back and just say why restore marine mammals? In addition to the legal mandates like the MMPA and the ESA, marine mammals are highly valued by the public, and yet in many places they're affected by a lot of human activities, particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. And in addition, restoration, particularly for DWH, is an ecosystem level approach, and marine mammals play a significant part of the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem and frankly all ocean ecosystems. There are a lot of really new and interesting studies that are demonstrating that marine mammals can affect ecosystems in diverse ways, and they play a role at multiple levels in the food web. A lot of people just think about them as predators and consumers, but in fact, there are a lot of contributions they make, and their role is a lot more complex than previously thought. For example, whales and other marine mammals defecate at the surface of the ocean. Their feces are liquid, they linger at the surface. This provides nutrients, particularly in terms of iron and nitrogen, which are available for phytoplankton, which are at the base of the food web. And so there's some really interesting studies documenting the mathematical contribution of those kinds of nutrients they provide to ecosystems. Even deep diving whales like sperm whales can translocate nutrients up in the water column. Also, some species foraging tactics facilitate foraging to other species, such as especially seabirds. And then also when animals die, particularly large whales, they create what's known as a whale fall, and they provide ecosystem structure and support for deep benthic communities. In some cases, scientists estimate they provide services for up to 200 years in those cases. So the point is, these are just a few examples, but the point is they play an important role in the ecosystem. So just a quick context for the diversity of species that we have in the Gulf of Mexico. There are 21 species of marine mammals, or cetaceans in the Gulf, I should say, representing 56 stocks. If you add manatees, it's 22 species of marine mammals. My focus is going to be cetaceans, or whales and dolphins. There is one endangered sperm whale, or it's not one endangered, it's very wrong. There's one endangered species that regularly inhabits the Gulf, and that's the sperm whale, and then the Brutus whale are proposed to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Other endangered whales may come and go, but those are the two most prevalent. Okay. All right, so marine mammals, as all of you well know, are long-lived. Some species 50 years or more, some even more than that. They're slow to reproduce. It can take up to 10 years to mature, and most, as I said, are predators of the ecosystem, but also contribute a lot more. It's obviously, and I think Lori alluded to this, it's logistically very difficult to study all species of cetaceans in the wild, and therefore there are many gaps in our understanding of even basic information, particularly for the oceanic species. So, there are many factors, too, that affect the health and survival of cetaceans, whales, and dolphins. These factors include things such as ensuring that there's suitable habitat, things like salinity, temperature, places to avoid predators, prey availability, things like abundance of prey, distribution of prey, diversity of the prey species, etc., extreme weather events, disease, unusual mortality events, harmful algal blooms, potential epidemics, pollution, human interactions such as bycatch in commercial and recreational fisheries, illegal feeding, intentional harm, and industrial activities in the Gulf such as oil and gas exploration, extraction, shipping, and noise. And so marine mammals in the Gulf co-occur with an abundance of human activities, and they face many natural and human-caused threats, many of which, as you can see, overlap, and the cumulative effects we don't fully understand. And so, so basically, given these uncertainties and things that we know and things that we don't know about marine mammals in the Gulf, how do you restore them? How do you go about this? And as I said earlier, typically in the NERD or OPA context, restoration is focused on tangible things. If you have 10 acres of marsh injured, you can plant 10 acres of marsh to restore. I'm oversimplifying it, but those kinds of things are a lot easier to think about. But restoration for individual species, particularly large marine vertebrates, is inherently very difficult and very challenging. You can't add water and grow them in the lab and put more animals out in the ocean. So therefore, the approach that's been taken for marine mammals is to think about restoration in terms of activities that can be done that are known to reduce or prevent threats, and therefore improve marine mammal health, improve marine mammal survival, and improve reproduction. And this is the approach taken in the Programmatic Damage Assessment and Restoration Plan that I'll quickly summarize. So I am going to take a little bit of a detour and put this in sort of the more, put this in the PDARC context, just so it helps you understand sort of how we're thinking about restoration of marine mammals and what the process is to get there. Because we're kind of in mid-process, really, and that'll make it a little more sense in just a minute. So the Trustee's Programmatic Damage Assessment and Restoration Plan is the foundational document that's going to inform restoration for marine mammals and many other resources for many years to come. And it also outlines the governance structure for NRDA, the process for decision-making, And it also talks about the opportunities for public input along the way, and that's very important in this whole process, is the public input. By the way, marine mammals are, for restoration are in Chapter 5, and you'll find information in the appendix. So I'm also going to show you, because of the terminology I'm going to be using, and because of how I'm going to tell you where we are in the process, I wanted to give you this very brief context. This shows a little bit of the governance structure. The PDARP is being implemented by the Trustee Council, which are 4 federal and 5 state trustees. They coordinate among all of the other all the other green boxes you see there. Those are called Trustee Implementation Groups, also affectionately referred to as TIGs. So the Trustee Council coordinates across all of those green boxes, all of those TIGs. They summarize and communicate restoration progress to the public, and they develop standard operating procedures. And then the Trustee Implementation Groups in the green boxes propose and finalize all decisions on restoration planning within the associated funding allocated by restoration type. And they also work on communicating with the public, providing opportunities for public comment, and environmental compliance and those kinds of things. And then there's the individual trustee agencies which perform the restoration planning, implementation, and monitoring. And I'm sorry to kind of go off on this tangent, but hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as we move along here. Okay. These are the dollars that are part of the settlement of the natural resource damage claims. I realize it's small. I realize you can't read it. I'm going to blow this up for marine mammals in just a second. But I just wanted to briefly show you the overall NRDA restoration funding, how marine mammals fit into it, along with the monitoring and adaptive management line. The marine mammals are highlighted in red in the middle there. And the rows that you see going down are the overarching 5 goals in the PDARP and the 13 restoration types, marine mammals being one of them, which is under goal 3 and highlighted, like I said, with the red box. There's a total of $144 million available for marine mammals. The columns show the restoration areas or TIGs, just like the box I showed you, so you can see them across the top. You've got region-wide, open ocean, and then each of the states after that. So, and then just one last reminder, this kind of does provide the framework that the PDARP is an ecosystem approach to restoration that provides hopefully benefits to all the resources that were injured from the oil spill. So this is just showing you a close-up of the marine mammal allocation that was just in that table. And it shows you by area, so region-wide there's 19 million, open ocean 55, Alabama 5, Florida 5, Louisiana 55, Mississippi 10. In Texas, there was no injury to marine mammals, so there is not an allocation for marine mammals in Texas, and then that totals $144 million. So, in the PDARP, these next couple of slides are outlining the PDARP. We articulate sort of the overarching goals for restoration of marine mammals. They're essentially targeted at reducing mortality, increasing survivorship, and improving resiliency. Specifically, in the PDARP, the trustees are clear that it's important to implement an integrated portfolio of restoration approaches to restore marine mammals across the diverse habitats and geographic ranges that they occupy. No one effort will restore marine mammals. It's going to take a suite of approaches to accomplish that. It's also important to identify and implement restoration activities that mitigate key stressors to support resilient populations. We need to do this by collecting and using monitoring information, such as population health assessments, for example, stranding data, and also other types of data to inform that. Finally, we need to identify and implement actions that are going to improve the animal's resilience to natural stressors, address direct human-caused stressors such as bycatch in fisheries, vessel collisions, impacts of noise and industrial activities, and all those other things I mentioned earlier, illegal feeding, harassment, hook and line fishery interactions, and so forth. So addressing those direct interactions. I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are some of the restoration approaches described in the PDARP, and then they provide a general guide to restoration projects for the future. Now, it's important to point out too that the specific restoration in the PDARC may be modified or added to over time as our understanding of best practices for what we know about marine mammals and marine mammal restoration evolves and changes. The trustees may learn through implementation of restoration, monitoring and other scientific support efforts, or coordinating with other research efforts, etc. And so that gets into sort of the adaptive component to this. So this graphic shows how monitoring and adaptive management is incorporated into all restoration approaches and efforts, not just marine mammals, but it does include marine mammals. And it's essentially a feedback loop to support restoration implementation. And you kind of have to imagine these sort of simultaneous loops going around and around, where you're monitoring restoration actions, you're evaluating their effectiveness, there's this feedback of information, and then refining what you're doing. And again, that's sort of getting to that monitoring and adaptive management cycle. That is something that a lot of folks are working on, the trustees are working on and thinking about this, both within resources, across resources, and again, thinking about it in the ecosystem context, but also down to the specific project context, which is a heavy lift. So in terms of, as I mentioned earlier too, monitoring and adaptive management are key features of the restoration portfolio for marine mammals. Monitoring is super important to evaluate whether restoration is meeting the goal of reducing mortality, increasing survivorship, and improving resiliency. And monitoring is also important for evaluating impacts of other non-marine mammal restoration activities on marine mammal populations as well. So another thing too, and Lori touched on this a little bit, but identifying baseline is also an integral component to monitoring. And I'm stating the obvious, but that's often missing for marine mammals, particularly oceanic species. Furthermore, something to think about is the type of monitoring data for marine mammals. What are the most important and effective metrics for understanding whether and how restoration goals are being met? And based on those metrics, what are the most appropriate methods and tools for data collection that should be used? And much of this is being thought about the trustees, as I said earlier, and also being thought about specifically for marine mammals. So these are just some of the things that are going into it. From the marine mammal perspective, there are several important characteristics to consider for monitoring marine mammals. First, and this is pretty, well, they're all pretty important. The data collected in the metrics should be sensitive enough to detect any improvement or decline in the population or changes in population health, the health of marine mammals. Second, and super important, is the data must be comparable across studies to ensure long-term basin-wide comparisons over time. It would be counterproductive to have lots of independent studies all using different methodologies where you can't compare those data across local and larger regional scales. And then for marine mammals, the duration of monitoring should be long-term. As mentioned, these animals are long-lived, and this means that they need that monitoring over a longer term to show indication of recovery. And for monitoring marine mammals, a suite of information is needed on their reproductive rates and success, their stock structure, their population health, their life history, survival, distribution, density, and habitat use. And abundance and distribution are also sort of the backbone metrics, if you will. They're super important, but they do tend to be a lot more coarse, meaning that by the time you observe a change in abundance, you might have missed your window of opportunity to adaptively manage. It may be too late. It's a slower metric, but it is the backbone metric. Now, this sounds like an awful lot, but it is achievable, particularly for some of the inshore species, by utilizing a suite of methods and tools in combinations with each other. Things like photo ID, biopsy, live capture, health release assessments, tagging, and evaluating stranding data and fishery observed data, etc. So as an example, if you have photo ID combined with remote biopsy sampling, you can provide information about stock structure, health status, reproductive rates, birth rates, diet, and contaminant loads, as well as co-occurrence with anthropogenic stressors. So in other words, just using those tools together, you can, the result can be a lot of feedback on a lot of those metrics. And modeling, of course, is an important tool to use and incorporate in this as well. So for oceanic species, this is a little bit more challenging due to the number of species, their broad geographic range, and just the logistical challenges of studying them. For many oceanic species, it may be that abundance and distribution is the only metric available that we have. Those data are typically collected via ship or aerial surveys or passive acoustics. But we do need additional metrics, and in some cases, we do need to collect other information to inform monitoring, and perhaps in the future we can see some development for remote tagging, remote biopsying, things that can help support remote health assessments of oceanic species, which would certainly add value to our understanding of these species and how they're responding to and what their needs are for restoration. Okay. All right. And I did want to mention too, there was, if you're super interested in reading about monitoring and marine mammals, there's a whole chapter on it in this National Academy of Studies report that came out. If you just Google monitoring marine mammals, National Academy of Sciences, it'll come up with this report, and you can read a chapter on what the National Academy came up with in terms of that specific to, it actually goes over a lot of the broad-scale ecological restoration monitoring, but then it does have a whole section focused on just marine mammals. Okay, so where is restoration for marine mammals right now? You can see that well, there's a circle around the region-wide. Before I go into that, I just wanted to mention that all the state TIGs are moving forward at different paces with restoration planning, and I will provide a link at the very end. If you go onto that link, you can follow up, you can click on each state, and you can find out exactly where they are in the restoration planning process. The region-wide TIG, which is circled here, which you recall includes all of the state and federal agencies together, all those trustees together. This particular TIG developed a strategic framework for marine mammals that was published in June of 2017, and this is the cover of it. And it was developed collaboratively with all the state and federal agencies. And the purpose of this strategic framework was to promote information sharing and coordination across TIGs for four resources: oysters, sea turtles, marine mammals, and birds. And these are all restoration areas that have region-wide funding, as I showed you in that allocation chart earlier. The trustees hope that this framework, and these frameworks for all these species, this is the marine mammal one, will be useful for restoration planning, implementation, and monitoring by all TIGs, and sort of kind of provide a guideline as we move forward developing actual projects. Okay. And the open ocean TIG, which is all the federal agencies, is in the process of developing a restoration plan that includes water column fish and vertebrates, sea turtles, birds, sturgeon, mesophotic and deep benthic communities, and marine mammals. Last year, from March 31st to May 5th, 2017, the Open Ocean TIG requested ideas from the public, and here you can sort of see the planning cycle for the Open Ocean TIG, and the green star indicates where the TIG is in that process. So the first step was project identification, getting ideas from the public. Right now, the TIG is in the process of restoration planning. The next step will be to come out with a draft restoration plan, which will also go out for the public to see and review. And then there'll be a final restoration plan, and then you go into the implementation phase, and then again you get into that monitoring adaptive management loop, if you will, there. So that's where open ocean is. Now, specific to marine mammals in the open ocean restoration plan, when that notice went out, and we're seeking sort of ideas from the public, for marine mammals, the trustees asked for input on areas such as reducing vessel collisions, reducing impacts of noise, better understanding stressors that threaten shelf and oceanic species. And then the TIG also asked generally for marine mammals and all the resources for input on related monitoring and adaptive management activities. And also for this open ocean restoration plan for marine mammals, the focus was on oceanic species of marine mammals. Okay, and then I'm just going to close with the link I mentioned earlier. If you want any information, or if you want to stay up to date or sign up for email alerts, etc., this is the the best website to do that. You can stay up to date on all phases of restoration planning, and a lot of what I've talked about is you can find on this website. So that is all I have. Thank you. We have a long way to go, but a lot of bright minds working on this, and we look forward to continue all the great work with all of our partners at the state and federal, and with all of you in the future. So thanks so much for your time.